The courtroom was filled with the hushed murmurs of impatient spectators. It was just another routine day, another case of a poor man facing the harsh realities of the legal system. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Richard Holloway sat with an air of superiority, lazily flipping through the case files. He was well known for his no-nonsense approach, but also for his lack of empathy when it came to those who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys. The defendant stood nervously at the podium. His name was Thomas Miller, a struggling single father who had fallen behind on rent after losing his job at the factory. His landlord had wasted no time in filing an eviction notice against him, and now he was here, desperately trying to plead his case. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice shaking, "I just need a little more time. I've been looking for work every day, and I have 2 young kids at home. If we get evicted, we'll have nowhere to go." Judge Holloway scoffed. He leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Miller, this court doesn't operate on sympathy. The law is the law. You signed a lease, didn't you?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, but—" "And you failed to pay your rent on time, correct?" Thomas nodded, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "I had no choice. My wife passed away last year, and with funeral costs and taking care of my children, The judge cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Excuses, excuses. Do you know how many people come through my courtroom every day with the same sob story? If I made exceptions for every sad case, then what would be the point of having laws?" A few chuckles erupted from the wealthier spectators in the gallery, mainly the landlord's lawyer, a smug-looking man in a tailored suit. Thomas felt his stomach twist. He wasn't expecting a free pass, but he had hoped for at least an ounce of human decency. Judge Holloway sighed dramatically. "Mr. Miller, unless you can show me right now that you have the money to pay your rent, I have no choice but to rule in favor of the landlord." Thomas's heart sank. He had barely scraped together enough for food, let alone months of overdue rent. His children were going to be homeless. The judge smirked. "No money? No defense? Then this case is over. My ruling is—" But before he could finish his sentence, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in an expensive-looking suit strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. The judge's face went pale. He recognized this man. Everyone in the courtroom did. Thomas turned around in confusion, unaware that his entire life was about to change. A wave of silence swept through the courtroom as the man in the expensive suit walked in. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor with purpose. Even the judge, who had just been mocking Thomas Miller moments ago, suddenly straightened in his seat. The man was Jonathan Reynolds, one of the most well-known and respected attorneys in the city. But more than that, he was a fierce advocate for justice, someone who had taken on cases that others wouldn't dare touch. Judge Holloway cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Reynolds, I wasn't expecting you today." Jonathan ignored the judge's nervous tone and walked straight toward Thomas, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder before turning to the bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to intervene in this case as Mr. Miller's legal representative." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Thomas's landlord and his smug lawyer exchanged worried glances. Judge Holloway scoffed, trying to regain his usual arrogance. "Mr. Reynolds, this is a simple eviction case, hardly something that requires your expertise." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Simple? You mean like how it's simple to throw a struggling single father and his 2 children onto the streets over a temporary hardship?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it. The judge bristled. "The law is the law. Mr. Miller is behind on his rent." Jonathan smirked. "That's funny, Your Honor, because I did some digging before I came here today." He pulled out a stack of documents and handed them to the court clerk. "Turns out Mr. Miller's landlord has been violating multiple housing codes, refusing necessary repairs, overcharging on rent, and even illegally inflating fees beyond what the lease agreement allows." The landlord's lawyer shot up from his chair. "Objection! This has nothing to do with—" Jonathan held up a hand. "Oh, I'm just getting started." He turned back to Thomas. "Mr. Miller, you mentioned that your landlord never fixed the heating in your apartment last winter, correct?" Thomas nodded, eyes widening. "Yeah. My kids had to sleep in their coats because the heater was broken for months." Jonathan turned toward the judge. "And, Your Honor, do you know what happens when a landlord fails to provide heat in the middle of winter? It's illegal. In fact, under city law, it's grounds for a lawsuit." Judge Holloway's expression darkened. He was quickly losing control of the situation. Jonathan kept going. "And let's talk about the rent increases. Mr. Miller's lease states that rent can only be raised by a maximum of 5% per year. Yet his landlord raised it by 15% in just 6 months. That's fraud." The landlord's lawyer was sweating now. "Your Honor, if we could just save it," Jonathan cut in smoothly, "because I have one more piece of evidence." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "This is a record of how many other tenants have been unlawfully evicted by this same landlord. And guess what? Every single one of them was either a struggling parent, a person of color, or someone who didn't have the means to fight back." A stunned silence fell over the room. Jonathan took a step closer to the bench, his voice quieter, but more dangerous now. "Your Honor, if you choose to rule against Mr. Miller today, I will personally see to it that this entire case gets escalated to the state level and that both this landlord and this court come under serious legal scrutiny." Judge Holloway swallowed hard. He was backed into a corner. His gaze flickered between Jonathan, the damning evidence in front of him, and the terrified landlord. He knew he had no choice. With a reluctant sigh, he adjusted his glasses and spoke. After reviewing the new evidence, he cleared his throat. "This court rules in favor of Thomas Miller. The eviction is dismissed, and further investigations into the landlord's practices will begin immediately." A wave of relief crashed over Thomas. His legs nearly gave out as he gripped the table for support. His kids wouldn't be homeless. The landlord's lawyer tried to protest, but Judge Holloway slammed his gavel. "This case is closed." Jonathan turned to Thomas with a smile. "Let's get you home, Mr. Miller." But as they walked out of the courtroom, neither of them noticed the judge sitting stiffly at his bench, his fingers tightening into fists. Because karma wasn't done with him yet. As Thomas Miller stepped out of the courtroom, a wave of relief washed over him. He had just gone from being days away from homelessness to securing not only his home, but also exposing the corrupt landlord who had preyed on struggling tenants. Jonathan Reynolds patted him on the back. Justice served, Mr. Miller. But inside the courtroom, Judge Holloway was seething. His grip on his gavel was tight, his knuckles white. This was not how today was supposed to go. He had been doing favors for wealthy landlords for years, under-the-table deals, quietly dismissing tenant complaints, rubber-stamping illegal evictions, and no one had ever dared to challenge him. Until now. He stormed into his chambers, slamming the door behind him. He needed to figure out a way to fix this. But before he could, his phone rang. It was his secretary, her voice shaky. "Sir, there are reporters in the lobby, and the district attorney's office just called. They want a meeting with you, immediately." Judge Holloway's stomach dropped. The media exploded with the story. What had started as a routine eviction case turned into a full-blown corruption scandal. Reporters dug into Holloway's history, unearthing dozens of questionable rulings, all favoring wealthy landlords over struggling tenants. The evidence was damning. Then came the whistleblowers, court clerks, former tenants, even other attorneys, all stepping forward with stories of bribes, forged documents, and abuses of power. Within days, the pressure became too much. The Judicial Ethics Committee launched an official investigation. And then the final blow came. One morning, as Holloway arrived at the courthouse, he was met with a swarm of federal agents. "Judge Holloway," one of them said, holding up a badge, "you're under arrest for judicial misconduct, bribery, and abuse of power." The once powerful judge stood frozen, his career, reputation, and freedom crumbling around him. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and bystanders whispered. As they cuffed him, a familiar voice called out. It was Thomas Miller. He stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the downfall of the man who had nearly destroyed his life. Holloway met his eyes, his face burning with shame. Thomas simply smiled. Karma's funny that way, isn't it, Your Honor? And with that, Thomas turned and walked away toward his kids, his home, and the new future that awaited him. Meanwhile, Judge Holloway was led into the back of a police car, the very place he had sent so many innocent people before. Justice had been served. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.